Hi there, and welcome to this Headspring webinar on developing leadership skills from the new normal beyond the COVID-19 era. My name is Desiree, and I'm a digital marketing specialist here at Headspring. I'm also your webinar host today. This webinar is intended to be interactive, so please do send your comments and questions over, and I will try to address them throughout the session. With us today, joining the panel is Adam Kingl, leadership and management educator, strategy consultant, and author of Next Generation Leadership. Adam also joined a webinar we hosted a few weeks ago. Adam, it's great to have you back again.
Nice to be here.
We're also joined today by Michael Skapinker, who is associate editor and columnist at the Financial Times. He is also executive editor at Headspring. Great to have you here, Michael.
Hello.
And last but not least is our moderator for this webinar, Paul Lewis, who is editorial director at Headspring. Paul, it's great to have you on board as always, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you both panelists, Adam and Michael, for joining this. And I wish everybody great health and safety, and hope that you can all work well in these very extraordinary times. Just to say a little bit about Headspring, when we look at leadership, we do, we have a particular approach. We have all the sort of journalistic skills of the Financial Times, and we have a huge array of academics and consultants and practitioners who weigh in and try to make sense of this very, very fast-moving, volatile business environment that we're dealing with. And really, I think nothing like this COVID-19 virus. It's really hard to sort of recall a situation, a dramatic situation that is so affecting business, really in the recent past. And how do we deal with this? What is our sort of approach, our diagnostic tool? And we have a diagnostic tool which we use with clients when we try to work out leadership. And without going into that necessarily, but just to say that we look at what's going on in the world around us. What are the big trends? What are the things affecting the business world? And how are these things likely to change the kind of skills levels, the training, the education that we need from corporate leaders in order to cope with that? So let me really start with this, try to understand, make sense of what is going on now in the wider world, that the business environment that's going to be affecting the way corporate leaders deal and make decisions. I think there are a few big trends that have been with us and are now being put into really sharp relief, real sharp focus by this coronavirus. And I want to really start maybe with Michael. Give us a sense about how this trend towards sort of maybe sort of nationalism or sort of self-sufficiency, a kind of localism that we've seen really over the last 10 years. I would say it's sort of almost an anti-globalism, and we've seen it manifested over the last decade. And we sort of, you'll remember because you've been a top journalist for 30 plus years, and you would have seen the anti-globalization demonstrations in the 1990s, and then we have the financial crisis, which is sort of almost the globalization, lack of control of where financial instruments have been. And then you have the sort of the Brexit election and the election of Donald Trump in the US and a rising nationalism. And now we have viruses, which really is a sign of sort of a kind of globalism out of control, the speed, the spread. So are we now looking at a continuation of this anti-globalist trend? Are we looking at people searching for some ways of self-sufficiency, both at a national level, an individual level, but also at a corporate level? Is self-sufficiency and a sort of retrenchment, is that the key trend that we're likely to see now accentuate? Michael, so that's a longish question, sorry.
Well, Paul, I'll break it into two. First of all, let's look at the national level, then let's look at the corporate level. On the national level, yes, I think we've seen a great trend of countries looking to themselves and to their own resources. You mentioned this is part of a trend that goes back. We could see this with the election of Donald Trump. We could see this with the Brexit referendum in the UK. We could see this with the rise of populist parties and populist leaders around the world. What we're seeing at the moment is countries really in very extreme circumstances looking after themselves. We've seen medical supplies, personal protection equipment diverted around the world, the US coming in and buying allegedly equipment that was bought meant to go to other countries. So we're seeing that at a national level. One of the most striking examples of this is the breakdown in cooperation within the European Union. We are seeing at the moment a real battle between the North and the South. We've seen a battle between the Netherlands and Italy, with the Netherlands refusing to sanction, refusing to allow the institution of Corona bonds, of Eurozone-wide bonds to support the Eurozone. So yes, we're seeing it at a national level. At a corporate level, I think we're seeing something entirely different. What we are seeing is how dependent companies are at the moment on their governments. We've seen extraordinary levels of intervention by governments around the world to support their companies. The Conservative government in the UK, supposedly the party of free enterprise, the party of letting the market do its work, has made an extraordinary intervention. For example, paying 80% of the salaries up to a certain level of people who've been put on suspended leave by their companies, who suspended their work. So I think we're seeing those two factors. We're seeing countries looking to themselves, but I think we're also seeing governments looking after companies. And I think that is going to have quite an impact after this, when this is over.
I mean, in today's FT, I think Philip Stevens, columnist, talked about the need for maybe a new sort of social contract between business and society and governments. Do you think we're now moving into a different phase where the whole idea of where business fits in with society has to change? Because this is something that you can't ignore. I mean, governments not only step in to try and solve the crisis and deal with it, but they also, you know, they're supporting companies. And maybe the corporate world now needs to rethink. I mean, it has been rethinking generally. There has been this trend, but now it's brought right up to date, and that we need this new social contract. Do you think there's anything in that?
I think we're seeing a huge change. Just to take the Financial Times as an example, as you said, Paul, I've worked at the Financial Times for more than 30 years. And throughout that time, the Financial Times has been a champion of free market capitalism. Certainly with a humane face, we've believed and advocated corporate social responsibility over many years. We've advocated restraint and responsibility on CEO pay. But last weekend, the Financial Times published an editorial. This is the voice of the editor and the voice of the editorial board, in which we said we're having to rethink the past 4 decades of economic thinking, of economic policy, and we're having to accept that governments have a primary role to play. We also said we're having to accept that public services, national health services, other public services are an asset rather than a liability. Let's go back to what Ronald Reagan said. Ronald Reagan said the scariest sentence in the English language is the government is here to help. People thought, oh no, the government never helps. The government always messes things up. I think around the world, we've seen a real reversal of that, and that is going to have long-term consequences.
And do you think, before I move on to Adam, do you think that that this is going to be a fundamental change, or could it just be we keep in the back of our minds that when we hit a crisis, the government is going to take over? I mean, I guess there's going to be the legacy of the economic damage that somehow, who's going to pay for that? How's that going to be distributed? But isn't there a point that we sort of revert back to what we knew, even if we can't go back the whole way, but we will still try to have the sort of globalized business that we're used to?
It depends how quickly this crisis ends. If it ended next week, yeah, I think we'd see a reversion to the mean. We'd see people returning to normal. We'd see people going back to what they knew before. But I think what's becoming clear is that this COVID-19 crisis is going to be with us for a long time in one form or another. It's becoming clear it's not just going to end on a certain day. Until really we have an effective vaccine, until most of the world is immune to COVID-19, I think we're going to see a fairly long period of us being subject to this crisis. And as long as that continues, people will look to governments. What we've seen here is governments, national governments, are the last resort when it comes to protecting people. And I think that's a lesson, particularly if this crisis goes on for a while, which it looks like it's going to. That's a lesson which is going to be very hard to unlearn.
I mean, just one final follow-up point on this. I mean, this issue of rely on government, relying on the nation state, we could say, that sense of self-sufficiency. But problems like this, one would have thought, have to be solved at an international level. So on the one hand, you're craving self-sufficiency, both as a corporate and as a government and as an individual. Same time, you're looking at how do we solve these things when the next crisis comes around. That at the same time, you need greater international cooperation. We haven't been getting it, maybe at a political level where we should, but certainly at a corporate level. Are we seeing the trend working in both ways at the same time?
I think where we are seeing international cooperation is on the scientific level. My colleague Anjana Ahuja at the FT wrote a very interesting column this week in which she talked about the international efforts to find an antiviral medication for COVID-19, a medication to treat COVID-19, if not to prevent it. And she said this was an international effort being carried out by universities and scientists, particularly in the United States, the UK, China, and Israel, sharing information, sharing what they know about this virus, looking at its vulnerabilities, looking at how it can be, as Anjana Ahuja put it, rugby tackled. So I think on the scientific level, we're seeing that. And yes, you're absolutely right. If we're going to go back to international trade and international travel, if borders are going to reopen, then yes, there is going to have to be some level of international coordination. But at the moment, in this crisis phase, I think we're seeing governments in many respects reacting, I suppose you could say, selfishly, or certainly acting for the benefit of their own people and their own citizens.
Adam, I want to, in a second, go on to issues around sort of the generational divide in business and society. But before we get on to that, is there anything you're seeing in terms of this pressure either to sort of batten down and survive or to sort of reach out and collaborate at the business level?
Well, certainly I think the virtual work that we're all doing, and this is a great platform of that, is demonstrating, I think, that global businesses are probably doing a better job now of communicating with all their people. Because I think there's still this entrenched assumption that the best way to communicate with your people is to call a town hall, get everyone physically together, right? And the CEO sits down and has an intimate chat. Well, that's not going to work anymore. And the virtual work that we're all becoming a lot better at is also forcing organizations to think about how can we communicate better, both with our people and with our customers, but just simply by thinking digitally, which a lot of organizations, let's face it, have been fairly mediocre about. Even on a personal level, I was just saying before we came on the air, I think everyone now has a space in their house, which is their home studio. And that's probably an element of our lives that we're not going to change when this is over. I think we all are going to know that corner of the house with good lighting, minimal sound, etc. Well, companies are doing that, writ large.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I will talk a little bit later about some of the skills and competencies that this is now throwing up, the need for new ways of working and how that plays into some of the established skills that, L&D people and HR people have been pushing, and how it affects it, whether we need something new, and whether when we tailor a sort of learning program, whether we tailor it in a way that now understands this potentially very new way of working. But before we do on that, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about this idea that there is now a bit of a generational sort of tension or divide, at least, between a sort of millennial, younger generation and an older sort of 60s, 70s, and you're seeing, look, financial crisis really showed about sort of the effect of asset prices getting out of control. You see people, younger people trying to get on a housing ladder, older people, sitting on huge amounts of assets. There's a sort of inequality dividing there. And then, of course, we know in Britain, the Brexit vote pretty much divided on demographics, age, that younger people voted to remain, an older generation voted to leave. And I think some of that also manifested in the US elections as well. Now we have a situation where we're seriously looking at online business, digital digital sort of communication as being the norm, possibly, as you're saying. And this is something that's maybe the younger generation are more capable of. The millennial generation that's now moving into management is very familiar with. An older generation, perhaps moving out of business, is still perhaps sort of struggling with. This might be a bit of a simplification. And of course, in the crisis at the moment, you know, there's young people who are being forced to stay at home. They're less prone to catching illness, as far as we know now. It's affecting an older generation. There just seems to be a big generational divide, and I'm just wondering whether or not we're going to see a fundamental shift when this is over towards a new way of working that favors a sort of millennial management tier. What do you think?
I think we will start to see a shift, and let's, you know, be honest. And you referred to this. If there is a, you know, a generational tension, it didn't start with COVID-19, right? It began quite a while ago, and if anything, it probably came into sharp relief during the Great Recession, 2007-8, when millennials or Gen Ys really got the sharp end of the stick because they were trying to enter the workforce at precisely the time that there were no jobs. Similarly, they are a larger population. So even if the economy is healthy, there's more competition for work, salaries, etc., that they've always faced. This is a generation who therefore either entered the workforce at a time of scarcity, or if they weren't yet in the workforce, they saw their parents or their older siblings lose their jobs, lose their pensions, etc. And what that taught them were a few things. One, certainly you have to rely on yourself. So they are a more self-sufficient generation. And this is due, by the way, to research I was doing over 10 years in researching the book, Next Generation Leadership. And so when we talk about the gig economy, Gen Y or millennials are really the experts in that because they didn't have to shift to that way of working. Many of them started and continue in that way of working. But let's just talk about those who are employees in that generation. The number one thing that they've told me they look for at work is work-life balance. So they've been saying this for almost 20 years. And many organizations, unfortunately, have been very poor about responding to that. Or more accurately, when older generations hear the phrase work-life balance, they think of that as a when statement. In other words, you want to work fewer hours, so you're lazy. You don't want to put in, I paid my dues, why don't you pay your dues? Blah, 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 blah. But the younger generation, when I asked them, what do you mean when you say work-life balance? What they said is that is a where statement. In other words, technology in many industries and functions, if not most, in the UK at least, allows me to work anywhere, anytime. So they're trying to explode the concept of FaceTime, don't leave the office until the boss does, etc. Particularly because technology, you know, has unfortunate consequences in that, yes, we can work anywhere, anytime, but that means we also do work all the time and everywhere. But Gen Y certainly has been more agile about adopting to that way of working. So what I hope is that if there is a silver lining to COVID-19, it's starting to destroy the semantic discord around the phrase work-life balance or virtual working between the generations. Because for those organizations that were resisting virtual working, they really have no choice now, right? So a lot of the excuses that they were giving, the lists they were giving about why it's inappropriate or won't work for you to work from home, those excuses are now held beneath the waterline, right? Because we're seeing all of those slowly be destroyed. So I think the virtual workforce, even among full-time employees, is going to be a shift. Yes, there's a spectrum, and we're not going to go all the way to the extreme where everyone's going to be working virtually all the time, but I don't think we're going to revert to the mean when this is over, because simply a lot of the old excuses have been demonstrated to be false.
Well, I mean, that sort of remains to be seen. I mean, let's see the difficulties of and the shortcomings of working. I mean, we're in a crisis mode of the situation, so people sort of accept there's, you know, some real rough edges in the way we're working. There are a lot of compromises, and that's fine. So the issue is when people come back from this, whether or not, as you say, the argument is, look, we've worked at home, it worked perfectly well, we were able to do everything that we needed to do. There's no argument. I mean, is that kind of the end of the debate in a way. And where does it go? Do we
Right.
all end up working at home, or what
Yeah,
are the limits
no,
there?
it's not the end of the debate for sure, and certainly some of my research has told me that certain activities lend themselves to face-to-face interaction. I'm sure we all intuitively know this to be true. Some activities actually do lend themselves better to working virtually. For example, brainstorming is an activity that we typically think we're supposed to get everyone together and get a big whiteboard and blah, blah, blah. But all the negative team dynamics that we all are aware of, particularly voices dominating due to status, gender, nationality, personality, etc., occur in those rooms. What we're seeing is when you do brainstorming as a for example activity virtually, you disintermediate a lot of those dominating voices, and you start to get a greater variety and number of ideas, which is exactly the point when you're trying to do brainstorming. So yes, but we don't know exactly what we're going to find works better or worse in a virtual environment. But certainly, I think we'll find that there are a lot more activities that either are just as good and in some cases better working virtually. I hope what companies don't do is blame their economic situation on everyone working virtually, right? It probably has more to do with the inability to serve customers than the fact that more of us are working from home.
I mean, could you get a backlash that people are so slightly traumatized by their isolation that when this is over, there's this rush to meet that people want now to have that human contact, and in fact, maybe it just has to find its balance.
That's right. So at the moment, if we're sort of here on the virtual spectrum, when things calm down or relax, I think yes, everyone's going to say, thank goodness we're back in the office. But then that's going to sort of settle. It'll settle back once people have scratched that itch of being back in the office and seeing their colleagues face to face again. But I would just emphasize again, I don't think we're going to a wholly 100% virtual workforce. And as I say, of course, there are certain industries and functions where that's impossible. But Gen Y, as the digital natives in our workforce, have always, been urging us to move a little bit farther down the spectrum toward virtual, and that's one of the benefits that I think we'll see. Not to mention that the enhanced engagement of that generation in the workforce, if they see that relaxing and granting of agency among their youngest employees, who, by the way, represent over half the global workforce already.
Yeah. Yes, it sort of makes sense. Desiree, sounds like is there a question from participants? I was going to say, please do send in comments and questions, and it looks like there are some coming in.
Yes, so we have 2 questions right now that came in that I think are quite interesting. So the first one is more about the kind of the changed climate that we might be able to assume after COVID-19. Given the forced remote working and majority of COVID cases being in dense populated areas, are big cities at risk post-COVID? If so, how will this affect work and leadership?
Sure, well, I could take that. Yes, I think that it does demonstrate that you don't necessarily need people more co-located. But as Paul rightly said, that remains to be seen. So I'm speculating, but that would be my guess. At the same time, I think that when organizations like or industries like manufacturing, et cetera, leave their warehouses in cities and those start to become startups, technology companies and service companies, et cetera, you might also see, because of lower rents, et cetera, a rejuvenation in urban areas, because it just seems to make sense, right, to populate urban areas with other industries. So rather than sort of a retreat to the country, what you might see is just a shift in terms of what are the best industries to occur in urban areas.
Michael,
can I just come in here, because one thing we haven't really talked about is what this crisis has shown about the divide in work and the divide in the workforce. We've talked about working from home. What we haven't talked about is the people who can't work from home and the people who are keeping us going throughout all of this. The most obvious example of this is our healthcare workers, doctors and nurses, and also the people who keep them going, the hospital cleaners, the ambulance drivers, the porters, and so on. But there's a whole group of other people who we really, as societies, haven't paid much attention to before, and we now realize how important they are. First of all, for example, care workers in old people's homes, the people who remove our bins, who remove our rubbish, our street cleaners, the supermarkets and the distributors of food, the truck drivers who are bringing food to the supermarkets and delivering them to home. There are all these people. They have been among the lowest paid. They've been among the people we've paid the least attention to, and we're now seeing how very important they are. Now, one of the things I hope we'll see coming out of this, I'm not sure how optimistic we can be about this, but a complete revaluation of this idea of skilled work and unskilled work, because what we are seeing is some of the work that we regarded as unskilled and this being the lowest paid are among the most important jobs we have in our society. So that's one thing. Now, this brings us on to the question of where people live. Can everybody spread out? Can people be out in the countryside working remotely? Well, we have to remember, we all still have to be fed, for example. We all still have to be serviced. We all still have to go to hospital. And that requires people to be pretty close to each other. It's very difficult to distribute food to people who are living in a very widespread way. Similarly, I have friends, I know people who are thinking, should I go to my second home in the countryside during this crisis? Apart from the fact that you risk the danger of, you risk spreading the virus to the countryside, they started to think, what if I become ill? Where is the nearest hospital? It's not 10 minutes away, it's an hour and a half away. We form together, we group together in cities for a good reason. And I don't think those reasons are necessarily going to go away.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely crucial, and it really lends itself to this change, this new social contract where people understand, reappraise the value they attach to certain types of work. And also, to add to what you're saying, Michael, these jobs which we need, they're also the people in the front line of the dangers. You know, bus
Absolutely.
drivers,
they can't work at home.
Yeah, they can't work at home, but they also, it's incredible, the risks, the personal risks to their health they are taking, and the toll is extraordinary. So we are moving to this point where we have to sit down and say, look, you know, we've seen how dependent we are. Our society, our businesses can't function without this. So there needs to, but I don't know what the exact trigger point is. Is it a matter of policy? Is it a matter of, you know, when does that change? At what point does one structure the society and the economy and the way business functions in a way that adds more value to these roles, these critical roles? Do you have any sense of that? What's the sort of policy issue? Is it a taxation thing?
Well, this is a very interesting one. On Twitter yesterday, I supported this idea that councils, local government and supermarkets should set up accounts so that people can show some appreciation by tipping the people who remove their rubbish, for example, because obviously people don't want to handle cash at the moment, so you don't want to leave out cash for them. Somebody replied to me, wouldn't it be better if we just paid them all properly? Which is absolutely true. But that requires a change from all of us. We're going to then have to pay, for example, for our rubbish removal, our street cleaning, we're going to have to pay higher taxes. And that is going to come at a time when government debt is going to be at absolutely sky-high levels when this is over because of everything they've spent. So, as I say, I think we should appreciate these people more. I'm not really sure we're structured in a way that allows us to appreciate them more. These are, as you say, Paul, these are the people who are getting ill. Some of these people are dying. There have been several deaths among London bus drivers, for example, who've got to go out to do their work, to take these crucial workers to work. These are often people who don't have cars, for example. Yes, we should have a complete restructuring. The question in, are those of us who are in these very comfortable or relatively comfortable stay-at-home jobs, work-from-home jobs, how much more are we prepared to pay for these services? It's a real challenge to us as societies.
Yeah, well, I mean, traditional thinking would say that it's going to be a supply and demand question, you know, but that plays itself out very, very slowly sometimes, and there's a lot of damage caused in the process. But before we get on to the next question, Desiree, just yep. Michael, in terms of those jobs that can be done and that sort of shaking out process where maybe we don't need all the infrastructure, could you just tell people about how the FT has handled this? Because that's quite an extraordinary story, how the leadership within the FT has both prepared and executed this kind of, you know, a response.
It's been quite an extraordinary story. So as most of you probably know, we have a print newspaper, which is printed all over the world and distributed all over the world. And we have ft.com, our website. We have been a remote working organization for quite a while, in the sense that we have 3 main news editing centers. Apart from London, we also have New York and Hong Kong. And we have been worried and preparing for many years about the shutdown of one of our cities, London or New York, through a mass disaster or a terrorist attack along the lines of 9/11. So we have been preparing for that, thinking about that, practicing that for a long time. What's happened now is we moved to a point where the FT said whoever can work from home should start working from home. We then reached the point where the newspaper and the website was being produced with just 2 or 3 people in the office. And then we moved to a stage where the Financial Times was being produced with nobody in the office. So this is quite an extraordinary thing. We haven't lost any of the editions. We haven't lost any of the website. We've managed to continue to produce one of the world's leading media products entirely with people working from home. So that has been an astonishing thing. I would say I think many people can't wait to get back to the office, can't wait to see their colleagues. There's an exchange of ideas, which is very important, but that's what the Financial Times has done.
Mm. Yeah, it's a real case study, isn't it, about how far you can push things.
Yeah.
Zero, there's another question coming in.
Yes, so this is regarding executive pay. Are leaders sacrificing their salaries to set an example to society, or simply to please investors and shareholders?
Michael, why don't you start off with that, and then
Well, I think the first reason they're doing it is to avoid severe embarrassment and reputational damage to their companies, because CEO pay has been a scandal that goes back decades, where CEOs and top executives have appropriated a huge amount of the company's wealth for themselves. I think nobody can stand up and say, well, I've furloughed my staff, I've laid off my staff, they're dependent on government assistance. Oh, and by the way, I'm still carrying on earning millions and millions every year. Now, I have been following this question of CEO pay for 30 years, and CEOs have always found an enormous number of excuses for why they should be paid so well. They've said it's an international market, or I don't set my pay, the board sets the pay, or it's such a high stress job, which it certainly is. I deserve this amount of pay. Yeah, executive pay is going down. I don't think, though, that we should underestimate the ability of people when they run something to say, you know what, I'm worth it. And one way or another, I'm going to get paid for this. Let's see how long this lasts.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, on the question of we do a high stress job, I don't think there's as high stress a job as a doctor dealing with coronavirus patients day in, day out, and seeing death all around them non-stop and not having the equipment. I mean, that's a high stress job. So
that
I
is
think
the highest stress job we see at the moment. And the jobs, as I say, of all of the hospital workers, just remember everything that goes into hospital work. Remember the people who clean the ambulance between hospital visits. There are so many people doing higher stress jobs now, exposing themselves to this. There is going to be some sort of reckoning with CEO pay, but as I say, there is a great tendency to revert back to where we were. It all depends on how soon we put this in the past. If this carries on for a long time, I think we're going to see fundamental and long-lasting changes.
Well, it may well be that the recognition now, this broad recognition of how important these other jobs are, the danger, the stress that people take, that maybe there's now a reappraisal about what jobs we really do value and what they're worth. And it goes back to this whole point of sort of that new social contract that maybe is there. Adam, do you want to comment on the executive pay issue and what's, whether that's going to change?
Well, I certainly hope so. But as you said before, I think if this is being driven mainly by market forces, it will take a while, and we've seen it take a while, right, for that shift to occur. But I think so many customers and employees are expecting a much stronger sense of triple bottom line, right? And how do we better serve our communities? One way in which we do that is that we make sure that no one is left behind in whatever society we're in. I don't think it's a coincidence that particularly some of the Scandinavian countries are always at the top of the league tables for happiest countries in the world and have lower gaps in pay among their companies. I think Michael would know this better than I, but the average CEO salary in a Nordic country is dramatically lower than what you would see in a typical Anglo-Saxon CEO salary. There's something to that. And don't get me wrong, I am not a communist. But again, I think we come to the conversation of spectra, and where are we on the spectrum?
Well, I think just to add on this final point, because it is quite crucial in terms of how leaders are perceived and the value that they bring in their companies. I think one very important thing which might come out of this is this sense of the immeasurability of performance, how difficult it is to attribute good performance or even bad performance to the person at the top. It's quite complicated. Whereas, if you're a doctor or you're a bus driver or you're a logistics person, whatever those jobs are that actually gets the food to people, these crucial things, that's far more measurable in terms of output. It's much harder to measure what you do as a knowledge worker at very senior levels because there are so many other factors involved. And maybe what we're seeing as a result of the corona crisis is that people will revert to saying, well, we want to know exactly what it is you've done before we reward you in these extreme measures. So maybe there's a very deep philosophical challenge now coming down the line on these issues.
And I think when you look at, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to, before we move on, Desiree, are there any other questions, or should we leave them for a few minutes?
I think we'll leave them for a few minutes.
Okay, so I wanted to just now go on to, we looked at the big picture, we looked at the kind of trends, and there are quite fundamental things coming down the line that might change the way leaders perceive their role and the challenges. Now, let's have a look at some of the actual competencies that are likely to be sort of affected, reshaped as a result of this. And we've talked about sort of digital, online working and so on. What competencies do you think now, coming out of the coronavirus, really need to be rethought? Are there any things that sort of stand out? Adam, well, let me start with you.
Well, I was looking again at the leadership framework that Headspring has. There are a couple things in there that really jumped out at me. One is resilience, right? So certainly this is testing all of our resilience, but I think we also have to think about it as organizational resilience, which is not just morale, right? But how we hold each other together, D&I issues, etc. And I don't think this is only in the purview of HR. I think it's a CEO responsibility, and I think it's a learning and development responsibility, because these are related to skills, right? That can be developed. The other has to do with innovation. Actually, in a time like this, there is a debate that every organization confronts itself with, and it happened in the Great Recession, and that is, do we retrench and just focus on on what we do? Or do we use this as an opportunity to reflect and debate whether our business model is still as relevant as it can be? So here again, I think the leadership competency that we're looking for is the ability to question one's mental models, particularly if we're all, many of us are stuck at home. We're doing a lot, maybe more reflecting, whether we want to or not. I bet a lot of us out there are thinking, in the coolness of the evening as we lay in bed at night, again, never having left the house, am I in the right job? Am I doing what I love? Am I working for the company that gives me what I'm looking for? And this is something that leaders, have to be thinking about. And part of that is making sure that the organization is always open to reinvention, whether that's incremental or exponential. And organizations are typically poor at this, or it takes them a very long time to question their orthodoxies. But this is precisely the right moment to think about how can we develop our organizational and leadership competencies in thinking about whether we are as relevant as we can be, instead of as risk averse as we can be.
Yeah, I mean, just to dwell on this issue of resilience, because it connects back to some of the bigger themes we were talking about. Your resilience partly depends on how much of a buffer you have. I think the sort of relentless need to become ever more efficient, to cut costs down to the absolute bare bone, and then suddenly we find we're in a rather desperate state. We rely on very, very tenuous supply chains, which demand that everything works perfectly and just in time. And maybe that corporate resilience, now that leaders are now going to have to look at that and say, well, maybe we need a bit of a buffer here. Michael, what do you feel about that, this relentless urge to cut to the bone? Maybe it's just, do we need to now rethink that, or is that something that's just going to be forgotten when we come out of this?
This is a very difficult one. It's a very difficult one because business is so hard. Business is hard in normal times. Just remember, most companies fail. Business is very, very difficult. And yes, one is always looking towards costs. You know, if your revenues don't exceed your costs, you're not in business. So I don't think from a corporate point of view, we're probably going to see more cost cutting. We're going to see people looking more at the costs of what they do. When it comes to public services, yes, they need more resilience. We now know that. We've seen health services in the UK and in the US, and even in a very well established health service like Northern Italy, being completely overwhelmed by this crisis. So yes, you need to build some resilience into your public services. Corporate resilience, well, I think that's really about, as Adam said, who are our customers? What do they want? How quickly can we adapt to serve them? Because they are under strain, they have less money, they are cutting their costs. So I think cost will still be important. But can I just come back to the original question of leadership attributes? Because I think Adam covered so many of them very well. I'd just like to sort of say three things. First of all, I think what this crisis is showing is three very important attributes of leadership. The first is the ability to empathize with the people who work for you. By that, I don't just mean saying, hey guys, you're doing a great job, well done everybody. I mean really understanding what they live with every day to get to work, do the job for you, confronted with all of their family responsibilities, illnesses in their family, children who've got problems, parents who've got problems. That's a very important part of management, is understanding what people are going through. The second attribute after empathy, and I think it goes along very much with empathy, is professionalism, getting the job done. I understand the situation we're in. We're going to do everything we can to help you, but we've got to get the job done. We've got to serve our customers. That combination of empathy and professionalism, I think we're seeing very, very clearly now. It's really distinguishing the best leaders from the others. The third, my colleague Peter Clark wrote about this, and excuse my language when I say this, what he said is no more bullshit. It's very, very important for leaders to tell their people the truth. And they've been very bad at that in the past. They surround everything they say with nice words, obfuscation, jargon words, saying we're a great thing, we're a great company, we're all pulling together, this is all great. People really need to know the truth. How secure is my job? How much of a future does this company have? Are we still going to be here when this is over? And if there's a possibility that we're not going to be here when this is over, then the head of a company needs to say, look, I don't know whether we're going to get through this. This is what we're going to do it. And I think what, above all now, CEOs, leaders, they need to level with people. They need to tell them what's happening. If the customers have dried up, if the customers are no longer prepared to pay, you've got to tell them that. So I think those are the three key leadership characteristics which have always been there, but which I think have been really emphasized, really stressed, really thrown into sharp relief by this crisis.
Right. So do you feel that the crisis is going to sort of support that trend, that people will be a little bit more honest and forthright, or do you feel that it's just going to be dealing with so many challenges that, you know, they'll just continue in the way they're continuing before? I mean, are you positive, I guess, about this?
Well, I think it's going to be a Darwinian process. I think the leaders who can really lead are going to come through this, and the ones who can't are not. And the price, unfortunately, is going to be paid by their organizations. But no, I don't think we're going to see. I mean, obviously, people will go back to sort of, you know, not really saying very clearly what they mean, not really leveling with people, not telling the truth to people. But what I think we've seen in all of this is how important these things are. There are good leaders, there are bad leaders. The best leaders are showing themselves at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. We're seeing the good, the bad, the ugly, actually very, very clearly. Well, two of the points you make are part of the sort of the values, the qualities that we would look to develop in leaders as we, you know, when we do our sort of diagnosis. One of them, obviously, is the question of integrity, which you allude to, setting the right example, but also shaping that corporate culture that says, look, we're in a new world, there are new expectations. to the world, and honesty and being straightforward and communicating very well is absolutely vital. But I want to just pick up on this other point you're talking about on empathy. Again, we would sort of talk about empathetic interest in others, and I know this may come naturally to many journalists because your stock in trade is to talk to people, to learn about things without a particular sort of agenda, just get to know people a bit more, sniff out where a story or something interesting is. Not everyone does that. This is why the sort of journalistic approach has been so valuable in the sort of business we do. But, you know, taking an interest, that sort of open-ended interest in staff and that empathy and so on, you know, if we're moving to this online, more online working, I mean, is that going to slightly cut off that ability to do that? You know, those serendipitous meetings in the lift where you have a quick chat and, you know, you find out a little bit about your, you know, your staff, your managers, your workers. You're not going to have that so much. How do you create the sort of empathy and show the interest where you're really just communicating digitally? Maybe Adam,
well,
you could, or Michael first.
Sorry. Let me just quickly talk, because I think Adam's probably got a lot of interesting things to say about this. I'll just say very quickly, there are two aspects to this. The first is, yes, you're right. The important thing about empathy is listening, but really listening to what people have said, and then reflecting back to them what they've said, so that even if you don't agree with them, even if you decide to make a different decision, they feel they've been listened to. As you say, that's very much harder to do at the moment. It's one of the reasons why I don't believe in this business about the end of the office. I think when we're back in a healthy situation, when the health crisis has passed, people will still need workplaces. So I think that's very important. But I think there's another aspect about this which is really being brought home by this crisis, and that is, you've got to be able to trust your employees. You've got to be able to trust your people. You've got to, and this has always been a mark of good leadership, judging people by what they produce, not by what you see them doing, not by having them in the office in certain hours, but saying to them, this is the job, this is what I need you to get done. And when they've done it, recognizing they've done the job. Now, this situation with so many people working from home is ideal for trusting people. Unfortunately, we're still seeing many leaders trying to find a way to replicate the office. We see this with these persistent online calls, Zoom calls, Skype calls, Google Hangouts. Every time there's a question, let's have a Zoom call because I've got to talk to you. I've got to see your face. Really what we should be saying, this is an ideal opportunity for saying, let me judge you by what you produce.
But isn't there a problem in our sort of knowledge-based economy where it's not always clear what people do from day to day? Yes, there is an output, there is expectation, but so much of it isn't clear. And I guess there's a sort of insecurity around that. People don't know, well, what are you supposed to be doing? And the only way to feel that the job is being done is to monitor your hours and check that you're online and you come to meetings. I mean, this is a real problem with the knowledge economy, and it feeds into executive pay as well, because, you know, what exactly are you doing? What do we expect you to do? As you say, it requires a huge amount of trust, but also an understanding of what the output is supposed to be as well. Adam, did you want to add something there?
Well, as you said, we're in the knowledge economy, not the industrial revolution. So these principles of scientific management, where I have to supervise my people every minute of every day and measure how, you know, to what angle they raise their arm to turn the screw, right? This is an extinct mindset. The problem is, however, still the way in which either we were taught to manage or the way in which we assume we're supposed to manage is still primarily based on philosophies of 150 years ago. And I think that's kind of the tension that you're seeing in behind the problem that you're seeking or that you're asking. So yes, I think we need more agency, right? We need to trust our people, and we have to allow, to our earlier point about efficiency, for more slack in allowing people to think about how to do their job to its best degree, to its highest performance. Some of our most celebrated companies, we all know, like Google, 3M, WL Gore, they give their employees a lot of time to pursue their own either passion projects and or simply to figure out how to do their job better. That is a positive symptom of the knowledge economy. it's no mistake, right, that these organizations are not just our most celebrated from an employee engagement perspective, but they're also among our most profitable. And what's interesting is that many of these organizations scooted ahead of their competition dramatically at the worst of economic times. So, for example, Lego, when times were tough in the Great Recession, they looked away from the US and said, this is a perfect time to think about whether we have a market in Asia and Europe. And lo and behold, in 2009, their profits grew by 63% in the Great Recession. Netflix, very similar. It was during the recession that they realized that they serve their customers better by streaming instead of mailing them DVDs. And lo and behold, their share price improved 57% during the Great Recession. So this also has to do with allowing your people to innovate, right? Allowing them to think about, could we be doing something a little bit differently or dramatically differently, instead of a lot of the philosophy of incremental improvement, right? How do we eke out an extra 1% here and there? I know the temptation, particularly now, is to do that, but I think it's got to be a bit of both.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, because another one of the sort of core qualities that we think we would look for is this sort of clarity of purpose, this sort of business instinct. And there you have an example where the business instinct is strong. Where's the market? Where's the growth? If we do things slightly differently and we're bold and we're trusting, actually we can do extremely well. And it's that quality to say, look, I understand where the business, I understand where the market is, I understand what you can do to tap it, and set proper goals, actually will get you there. And also, interestingly, how in the middle of this crisis, we're seeing amazing examples of innovation and collaboration. I know innovation and collaboration has always been sort of constant themes in management, but we're seeing the practical ways in the most extraordinary examples of how companies are trying to find problems, companies you wouldn't even expect or think about in terms of building ventilators or masks or logistics and getting food. So I think that's yeah, I mean, I think this issue of collaboration and innovation as well lends itself is a very sort of powerful motivator. Now, Desiree, there's some more questions from participants.
We do have more questions, yes. So I guess we've talked quite a bit about the main skills you need as a leader throughout this crisis, but what about after, and how would you compare them? Would leaders have to pivot their leadership skills somehow to be good leaders in a year from now, or whenever this crisis will slow down?
Yeah, I mean, this is an absolutely crucial question. Is this the sign of what's going to happen? Or are we going to shift to a totally different way of working, or not? Or are we going to revert back? I mean, we don't really know. Michael, do you want to have a go at answering that?
Well, I think the first thing, sadly, we have to remember is a lot of businesses are not going to survive this crisis. A lot of companies are going to go out of business. A lot of people are going to lose their jobs. For the survivors, yeah, it's going to be a reconstruction. It's going to be, how do we get our business back? How do we get our customers back? Do our customers want to work in the same way? I think leadership is going to require all of those skills I mentioned earlier. It's going to require empathy. It's going to require being able to trust people. It's going to be able to require telling people the truth. It's also going to require a very, very shrewd reading of the market. What do customers want now? What will customers want? So I think it's really going to reward those people who really understand. We always got to go back to what the great management thinker Peter Drucker said: business starts with a customer. Without a customer, you have no business. So it's going to be those people who can really understand what do customers want most after this.
Adam, how do you view it?
Well, certainly I think the empathy point is something worth emphasizing, but I'd also add customer empathy, right? This is a perfect time to get more in communication with your customers, to figure out what do you need now, and don't assume that what they need now is what they needed yesterday. And once you ask those questions, then you might find that you're challenging everything you believe, whether it's about your industry, whether it's your company's mission, its operating model. All of these assumptions are worth testing, because all of our orthodoxies about how we stay relevant are always open to disconfirmation. So we have to think of these as hypotheses instead of cemented never changing beliefs. The future has a way of making monkeys out of individuals who cling too tightly to their certainties. And today we are certainly questioning many of our certainties. And regardless, even so, while incumbents are certainly afraid for their future, they have every reason to be. And while they might, because they have cash, might survive, there are also a lot of insurgents out there, many of whom are going to go under, unfortunately, but many of whom are going to look for those opportunities that the incumbents are ignoring. And this is going to be their opportunity to scoot ahead. So, I think now more than ever, cerebral sclerosis is going to be deadly.
So when you're looking ahead now, so the crisis is over, we're a year in, this is just, guesswork here, a year in, there's some sense of normality, we hope, because maybe it won't go back to a normal situation. We don't know. We don't know whether the virus is here to stay. You're sort of saying that, okay, there's going to be huge disruption to the market because some companies will have gone out of business, but the customers' own perceptions of what they want will also have changed. So the customer themselves are now thinking differently. And I'm just wondering whether or not this demonstration of collaboration and support and sort of social value that we're seeing is now going to inform the way the customer looks at the good. And we've already seen that in terms of the sustainability shift in customer attitudes. But maybe we're saying a year, 2 years from now, this will be a fundamental change, and that's what businesses now have to adapt to. Do we have time for one more question, Desiree?
Yeah, so another question that we received is, do you think there will be a tipping point where the response becomes greater than the problem in itself? How long can governments keep printing money? And what about the next possible wave in third world countries?
Well, I think that could be dealt with in about 20 seconds. Don't you think, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is I don't know. This is the big debate. There is a trade-off. There's a trade-off between preventing people getting ill, preventing people dying, which is obviously an absolutely ultimate aim, against destroying the economic life that keeps us going. How we do this, I don't know. I suspect we're going to, as this thing is slowly brought under control, move to a point where we have lockdowns lifted, lockdowns again, economic activity returning, economic activity being suppressed. Yeah, when we reach that tipping point, I don't know. The major economies, countries like Germany and France, are already in recession. We've had huge unemployment increase in the United States. When do we reach that tipping point? Have we already reached that tipping point? These are going to be very hard questions. I can't pretend to know the answer.
Yeah, but there are a lot of different approaches from different countries. So when we look back in a cold academic way, we may see who sort of managed it successfully, who didn't, and maybe that'd be a path forward. Adam, in our last few seconds, is there anything you want to add to that sort of that big question about the economy versus people's safety?
Well, yeah, I think every organization out there is struggling, and every government is trying to get the balance right. And there's no right answer here. And every society's values might actually help determine where they land on that balance. But I think Michael mentioned earlier that there's probably going to be a reckoning when things settle down, and that is which companies in particular sort of demonstrated that they did their bit for their customers and their communities. And I don't mean to put that in sort of the cold light of day and say, so therefore, doing right is simply a commercial equation, but it is partially. But so I think that we have every reason to really think about the health and well-being of our communities and our customers now, rather than out of fear, sort of hide under the bedclothes and hope that we can just get through this and nothing will change.
Yeah, look, I think this is absolutely right. This idea of a reckoning, that how have you behaved up to now? How have you behaved in this crisis? And what does that mean for the way you're going to operate in future is vital to the way leaders run their businesses, set examples, for the foreseeable future. And I think this coronavirus crisis really has sharpened it all up now for leaders. They have to think, what do they need to be doing now for the future? What kind of learning, what kind of skills you need to refine, adapt, because the world may be very different at a very operational level as well as a huge sort of macro level. It's all up for grabs now, I think. Anyway, look, I just want to thank you both. Thank all of you, Desiree too, for managing such a smooth operation here. Adam and Michael, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you everybody who has dialed in to this discussion. Thank you very much for the questions, and please stay safe, stay well, and we'll speak to you all next time. Desiree?
Thank you so much, everyone. We will send a recording out later today, so you can rewatch it if you want. And do also fill in the survey that we will send out, so we know what to do next time. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.